Mike Shriver is, in a word, lively. As a survivor of the AIDS epidemic, living with HIV for over 30 years, Mike has experienced more loss than even he can comprehend, but that has never quelled his passion for life and his desire to change the world.
By the time I leave the seminary in 1987 and I move out to Oakland to move in with my first boyfriend, uh, the epidemic is beginning to get closer and closer to me with my circle of friends. Of my circle of friends at this point in time, in 1987 and 1980, of my circle of friends, there were 10 of us. And of those 10 men, only one of us is still alive. 8 of those 10 men died of AIDS. The other individual, being my first boyfriend, died of an overdose years later. But but of my original circle of 10, there's nobody left. A really dear friend of my boyfriend at the time said, "I really want you to come with me to this ACT UP meeting." And so I went to one of the first ACT UP meetings here in San Francisco and immediately felt like this is where I belonged. So in January of 1989, in the first time in its history, the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge was shut down by a political protest. And that political protest was a group of us who shut down the Golden Gate Bridge in protest of the way in which the AIDS epidemic was being handled federally, statewide, and even locally. That even in San Francisco, where the response to the epidemic was the best in the country, if not the world, it wasn't great. Oh, we also disrupted the opening of the San Francisco Opera because it was just appalling, the lack of philanthropic response to the epidemic here in San Francisco by a lot of individuals that had means, that had the ability to invest philanthropically. And so we disrupted the opening of the opera. And if you're sensing a theme here about activism and inconvenience, it's because there is a general theme about some of the AIDS activism that I engaged in. It was predicated on the issue of inconvenience. What you in privilege feel is me inconveniencing you by me shutting down the Golden Gate Bridge or disrupting the opening of the opera, like that's a momentary inconvenience. But for someone living with HIV or with AIDS, the fact that there isn't good primary medical care, the fact that there aren't treatments that are available and affordable, the fact that it's, insurance can deny it, that the system is built to not help you, that's an inconvenience of an unendurable length. And so a lot of the activism that I engaged in was saying, look, I'm going to make you feel in the short term inconvenience so that you understand and have empathy for those people that for whom inconvenience is a lifetime now.
In addition to his good trouble with ACT UP, Mike also dove headfirst into public policy and advocating for legislative and systemic change. Mike worked with Representative Pelosi for over 20 years, served as San Francisco's health commissioner, was the AIDS czar advisor to Mayor Willie Brown, and even spoke with President Clinton as the board chair of the AIDS Memorial Grove in Golden Gate Park.
Put one of my closest friends' names in there a couple of years ago, a friend of mine named Patrick Leach. When Patrick was dying, before he went into a coma, this is a true story, before he went into a coma, he looked at me and he said, just face it, Mike, you're just too mean to die. And then he went into a coma, seriously, right after that he went into a coma. And so imagine being the person to tell his mom what his last words were. But, in 32 years, I never imagined this is where I would be.
I had at least one friend a month, every month for 7 years. Die of AIDS. Friend. Not counting colleagues or no, but these were the people that were here, that were part of that were close. of that group of 10, by this point now, it was just me and my ex-boyfriend that were still alive. The second group of 10 men that it really became sort of my core group, I am the only one left from them also. So of that whole group of the 20 of us, I'm it. I got involved in doing HIV work professionally. It was, and like really focusing on HIV and AIDS work. It was exclusively public policy, legislation, advocacy, and lobbying, either for funding or for better policy, or working with the federal, you name it. I did a whole bunch of stuff. What was different about that time from when I was in ACT UP was not just the fact that by the time I start working in Washington, D.C. in 1996, remember, that's the year that we have the big breakthrough in AIDS drugs. And the new class of drugs is released, in 1996, that really has had a profound impact on people with HIV disease. The protease inhibitors is what they're the class of drugs, and all these drugs that came out in 96, and from that point forward. Before 1996, we didn't have effective treatments for HIV. We had treatments for the opportunistic infections. Once we actually saw treatments for HIV that actually helped reduce someone's viral loads, so the amount of virus in your body, actually helped clinical outcomes like reduced mortality, and actually help people live longer and actually regain a lot of strength and mobility and get their lives back, the policy world really shifted dramatically. My passion for the work that I was doing didn't change, but what did change was my relationship with federal agencies, because now, and I really loved doing this work, particularly after the advancements of 1996, that we were about crafting how to change the Medicare system and the Medicaid system so that more people could get coverage so they could get into healthcare. Making sure that folks that were doing HIV prevention planning were the people who are the most impacted by the decisions that someone was going to make. There really is. It's a great question, because there's a quantum difference between desperation advocacy and then public health advocacy that's not based on fear and death and dying. And it was that dramatic of a shift with the new drugs. In 1997, the BAR, the big, queer rag here in the city, the queer publication, in 1997, for the first time in 16 years, they didn't have any HIV or AIDS-related deaths in their obituaries. It was a huge deal. In the late 80s and in the early 90s, you would open up the gay, the queer press, and there would always be obituaries. And you would just see obituary after obituary, this person died, this person died, this person died. And you get used to it. You get used to opening up the paper every week and seeing just countless number of individuals who died of AIDS. And that went on here unstopped for over a decade and a half, that every day, every Thursday, you'd go get the BAR and you'd open up and you would just see, the obituaries. And in 1997, it was magic that you opened up the BAR one day and there were no AIDS-related deaths. When I tested positive, I didn't allow myself the luxury of imagining a world without AIDS, because there were no treatments. It was a fatal disease. Everyone that I knew that had it was dying. There weren't treatments. In 1989, I couldn't honestly let myself think about a world without AIDS. That's what I was fighting for. But I couldn't just sort of believe it, because all empirical evidence spoke to the contrary. If you had told me in 1989 that 8 years later, I would open up the BAR and there would be no obituaries, I would have told you in 89 that you were crazy, that you were a dreamer, that you had your expectations set too high and you needed to level set them. That's what I would have said in 89. because in the midst of the plague, hope was a commodity that nobody was willing to barter in. Hope was a commodity that you couldn't entertain. I can have the worst day of my life, the worst day of my life. And just remember, undetectable means that I get to have an infinite number of really bad days now, right?